No runner wants to wear a walking boot, but sometimes they're necessary, and you need a good plan for returning to sport after you've been in one of these. Let's go through how to do that. In today's video, we're going to cover why you might have to wear a cam boot, some key things that you need to remember when progressing back to daily activities, exercises you want to go through, and then how to go back into your sport, specifically running. There's lots of times when distance runners might have to wear a cam boot. Cam means controlled ankle movement, and its job is to protect your foot and lower leg from some excessive stresses. When you're in a boot, you can't move from your ankle or the front part of your foot. It prevents your shin from moving forward and you to go up on your toes. And there's a few different reasons why we might want that. This could be after an operation. You could be dealing with some kind of a stress fracture. There's lots of different reasons why you might need to wear one of these. And it's common for distance runners, gymnasts, basketball players, and lots of athletes to have to wear these at one point in time. We often don't have a good plan for how to return to our activities after wearing one of these. While a boot might help you heal from a specific injury, you tend to be in a worse situation once you get out of that boot. Let me explain. When you stop doing something that your body is used to, it adapts. That could be running, jumping, exercises, lifting weights, whatever it is, but you're going to be in a little less shape after wearing one of these. And we've learned these from studies in mice. Pikachu is going to represent our subject. So normally mice walk like this, with 4 feet on the ground. There was an interesting study by Coe and colleagues where they took mice and they brought their back feet off the ground and had them stay that way for a prolonged period of time. And what they found was that the longer that you spent in that non-weight bearing environment, the worse your body tissues got. Bones got a little less dense, they got a little weaker, muscles got a little smaller, all things that probably happen when we go into a cam boot on crutches or some other situation where we're doing less than our body is used to. And they found that that loss in these characteristics was proportional to the time that you spend in that environment. We need to recover those before we really start to stress our body. And if we go back to what that cam boot does, it specifically prevents bending forces from our shin and from the front part of our foot. So we want to progress back our bending stresses in 2 different ways. First, we want a gradual transition through different footwear. When you're coming out of a cam boot, it's probably not ideal to go directly to being barefoot or in very minimalistic footwear. In fact, you might even need to start with something like this. If we do a simple brake test, you see that it takes a lot more force to bend this shoe back, which means you're going to be able to have a little less stress on those tissues that we're probably wanting to recover. Over time, you might want to progress to a shoe like the On Cloud Monster, which again has more stiffness in this bending test, so we gradually introduce those forces to whatever area is recovering. This is particularly important when dealing with stress fractures of the feet, especially the 5th metatarsal, navicular, and the 2nd metatarsal, all high-risk sites. And finally, you might want to progress to this Ultra Escalante racer that I can bend in half very easily. But simply a gradual transition of footwear is not going to prepare our tissues for the demands of sport. The first way to do this is to gradually increase your step count throughout the day. I think it's ideal to progress 500 to 1,000 steps per week to whatever your daily total is. And ideally, I want every patient to be able to have 10,000 steps in their day without pain before we start to introduce higher levels of loading. While we increase that step rate, we can also incorporate some exercises, and we're going to start with bilateral exercises like goblet squats and kettlebell deadlifts that don't require you to go up on your toes, but they can serve to help the muscles of your lower body get in a better position to deal with sport. Once we've mastered those exercises where 2 feet are on the ground, we want to start to introduce single leg activities that put you on your toes. I like to start with marching progressions that eventually lead to step ups and finally step downs. All exercises that are going to put us on one foot in a controlled manner, but don't require us to go up on our toes, increasing those bending forces. And finally, along that path, we're going to need to increase the bending forces. So we're going to do things like bilateral calf raises to single leg calf raises, and eventually calf raises with a dumbbell or kettlebell, and finally a barbell. I want all of this to happen before we start running, turning to our sport. Finally, we're going to introduce some plyometrics like bilateral and unilateral pogo jump, and then eventually a return to run progression. I think there's some fundamental tests we need to be able to do before we start a run progression. You should be able to walk 10,000 steps in a day without pain. You should be able to complete 20 single leg calf raises through a full range of motion without pain. You should be able to complete 20 lateral step downs without pain. And finally, you should be able to complete 3 sets of 30 single leg hops on the affected side without pain. And the timeline of this rehab should reflect the timeline that you spent in that boot. Once we've checked off all that, then we can start a return to run progression. And if you play multi-directional sports, we can start to introduce things like cutting, jumping, and eventually actual play. Have a plan, make it progressive, and make sure that it reflects the demands of your sport. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below.